3. All right, welcome back to the hub, Mr. Hagen. It's awesome having you on. This really is a treat for me. As I've said earlier, this will be my last episode until the next presidential election cycle. That's kind of when I really get on and really start talking politics and discussing with people I know. So I thought it would be a real treat to bring back my high school econ teacher. So, big influence on me, big influence on a lot of students, taught AP economics in Ephrata or Amishville for my friends who aren't in Pennsylvania. That's what I normally would say. You would like this, Mr. Hagen. People, you go to college, and I know you have a son who's looking at going to college right now. So you're in the middle of this, but people always ask, "Oh, where are you from?" And I'll be like, "Oh, Pennsylvania." And they'd ask like, "What part?" And I would say Lancaster, and they would say, "Isn't that where all the Amish people are?" And going to a place like BYU, which is predominantly LDS or the common term Mormon, they would be like, "Man, Amish and Mormon, like what's going on?" So it was always a fun conversation telling people where I was from. So, but Mr. Hagen, he's had a big influence on a lot of students. So, welcome to the podcast, Mr. Hagen.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me on. This is exciting. It's my first time to be interviewed by a former student.
Probably won't be your last. You've had some pretty when I look at some of my classmates and some of the other students, we've had some students go on and do some pretty cool stuff. We have a student who's working for BlackRock right now. We have a student who has their PhDs teaching at George Mason, I believe.
She went to George Mason.
She went to George Mason.
Teaching somewhere up in New York, and I think is over in London right now, doing some kind of visiting professorship, something like that. But yeah, PhD in economics. There's another one I was just visiting down in Virginia. He worked for a hedge fund company.
Yeah.
So yeah, a lot of students doing cool stuff. I can't take credit for all that stuff, for all those things.
No, I think you can. I think you can.
I'm glad to take it, but I don't think I deserve it.
So for our listeners, why don't you give a little background about how did you get started teaching AP economics? Like how did you end up doing that?
So I actually attended the high school at which I currently teach. My father was a gym teacher and a head football coach there. And I graduated in 1988 and went off to college and had no idea in the world what it was that I was going to do. I wasn't a particularly good high school student. I was okay. I was smart enough to kind of get by, but I wasn't, nothing motivated me. There was nothing that really got my interest.
Larry Lover Lips was focused on other things. So.
Yeah, that might have been true. And so hard to believe you still remember that story. So
it was an epic story.
Yeah. So I went to Hagen University, state school in Pennsylvania with really no direction or idea what I was going to do. And my dad said, "Why don't you think about majoring in social studies? You always kind of liked history." So I declared myself to be a social studies education major. And as part of a social studies education major, you have to take an economics course. And so I took an economics course with some guy named Doug Wyan, fantastic teacher, and very quickly fell in love with economics and thought, this is what I want to do for the rest of my life. I want to think about, at that point in my life, I want to think how to make the world a better place. And I still think that matters, but that was my motivation at the time. How do I make the world a better place? And how do I learn more about how the world works? And so I was falling in love with this subject of economics. And one night in particular, and I remember it very clearly, I was wandering through the book stacks in the library. And what I would do during my breaks, I was kind of an odd college student. I was exactly the opposite of my high school self, is I would study for 45 minutes. And then during my 15-minute breaks, I would just kind of wander the library.
Yep.
And I would wander the library and look for something to read during those 15 minutes. And I would just randomly grab, a book off a shelf and just, read the first chapter or something like that. And one day I pulled off the shelf a magazine called National Review. It's a very conservative magazine started by William Buckley. And at the time I didn't know that. And I pulled that off the shelf and I just opened it up. And so this would have been 1991, maybe something like this. And I pull it off the shelf and I just open it randomly to a page. And here was a short article on the obituary of a guy by the name of Friedrich von Hayek, who apparently had just died. I have no idea who this guy is. I read the obituary and I think, wow, I want to learn more about this guy. And so I went and read The Road to Serfdom. And then I read some more Hayek. And all of this then, okay, so I've dug why and get me interested in economics. I'm now reading about this guy, Friedrich Hayek. And all that comes together with me ending up applying to go to a PhD program in economics at George Mason University, where they teach kind of Hayekian type of economics.
Right.
And so I'm at George Mason and I begin running out of money. One of the things that I did was the government had given me loans to go to George Mason to get my PhD. I ended up refusing the loans. I turned the loans down and repaid them. And as a result of that, I could no longer afford the PhD program. So I had to switch to the master's program. Meanwhile, my wife got a job in Lancaster County teaching kindergarten. And so we moved back up here and I was commuting down to George Mason, 2 days a week, something like that, and taking classes. And so I began subbing at this school called Ephrata High School. And they then offered me a job to teach history. Well, that was not my long-term goal, but I thought, all right, well, I'll teach for a year or two until I find a job in the business world or at a think tank or something along those lines. And so I started teaching history classes. And I asked if I could start an economics class. And they allowed me to start this class called Honors Political Economy. And the first year we had 22 kids in the class. And 3 years later, we had 105 students in the class.
Wow.
And I was teaching that class 4 periods a day. And then I remember, I won't see the student's name, but I remember this particular young lady saying to me in class one day, Mr. Hagen, this class is amazing. Are there any other econ classes that I could take? And I was like, well, what other classes would there be? And she said, well, is there an AP? Is there an advanced placement economics? And I didn't know if there was. And I said, well, I don't know. I'll look into it. And it turns out that there was an advanced placement economics. I went to administration. They let me start that. And so here we are 25 years later. And, that's what I teach all day is honors college economics and AP economics. And it was never planned to be this way. Ephrata was going to be a stepping stone as I was heading out into the business world. And here I am. And I'm very happy with the way it worked out.
Well, I remember our our last conversation when I was back home in Pennsylvania for Christmas, we were talking about, no, maybe it was a year ago. We've had lots of good conversations over the years, but I was asking you about, entrepreneurship and starting things up, and you kind of relayed your story about how you basically essentially like you created your own little world there in Ephrata High School. You created the AP econ class, you created these econ classes, and it kind of, I don't want to say it was your baby, but that wasn't there before. And
it wasn't there before. And my model was, so, I had studied economics. My model was to come in with an entrepreneurial attitude. And my idea was to build something that did not exist before, and to not, force students to take it. I had to compete with other classes to get students to take my class. I had to provide a quality product to attract people to take it. And so that very much, that market model is very much my model. And most years, all the courses I teach did not exist when I showed up.
Yeah, I remember. So for most of my listeners know, but some might not. So I moved when I was a junior in high school from Ohio, my dad's work forced us to leave Ohio to come to Pennsylvania. And again, as part of the LDS Church, or Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, there's branches all over. And when we moved, there was another congregation, and the Singers, if you remember the Singers,
Sure.
Jordan
Yep.
Singer.
Yep.
So we went to church, and new family, don't know anybody, like totally new, right? We have no family there, no connections. And I was talking to Jordan and saying, "Oh, I'm going to Ephrata High School," and he's like, "Oh, I'm there now. I'm a senior." And as a junior, the only thing he really told me was like, "Oh, it's a good school. What you really need to do is take AP Econ." Like, this is the first thing he tells me. I'm a brand new student. I don't know him at all, right? I don't know the Singers at all. I don't know anybody. And all he says is, "Oh, you need to take AP Econ. Like, he's a great teacher. Take AP Econ." And so,
and I'm glad that you did.
No, I'm super glad I did too. And so, I show up first day to high school, right? And like, all the emotions, right? Brand new high school,
Yep.
you want, and I'm talking
nobody.
Nobody. Talking to the guidance counselor, and I'm just like, "Hey, I want to take this AP Econ class." And she's like, "Oh, okay." But a little, and I don't know if you remember this too, but after the first class, I come up to you and I say, "Hey, do you know Thomas Sowell, Walter Williams?" And your face like lit up. And you were like, I studied at George Mason. I took a class from Walter Williams."
Yes.
And it's just interesting, like, growing up, my dad always got this like conservative newspaper.
It's probably the Conservative Chronicle.
Yep, that's what he got. And Walter Williams and Thomas Sowell were always in it. And it was interesting because, like, there's a whole wide variety of views on issues. Like, it's just a bunch of different columnists, and they put them all together, but they can talk about anything. So you'd see like neoconservative, you'd see like far right, you just see more in the middle. You just see a wide variety of views. But he always just loved reading Walter Williams and Thomas Sowell, and so he'd always tell us, he's like, not the rest of it was garbage, but he's like, "Hey, the best ones in here are Sowell and Williams." And so, as a kid, I'd read them once in a while. I'd never really understood, I didn't understand a lot of the theory, and I wanted to. And so it really was pretty awesome. I felt very fortunate. Ephrata is it's not Manheim Township. It's not Hempfield. It's not like the big schools, but it's it packs its it definitely has some other stuff that is like, I was glad I went there. So
yeah, so I always thought that we were very competitive with those other schools, and if you don't mind me saying so, I thought our economics department would be very competitive with those schools, and I'd be glad to take them on in, I don't know what the competition would be, but forget all these sports and so forth. We'll take them on in econ any day of the week.
Oh, that's too funny. Well, speaking of students, so as over your 25-year career, what have you observed about students who've taken your class after they're done? Like, what's one of the main takeaway you could say after students take your class?
Well, I guess what I want students to take away, and you probably could tell me better if it's actually what you take away. What I want students to take away would be two things. One is an ability to think.
Yeah.
And number two would be, and when I say think, to also challenge your own biases. I grew up, my father read the Conservative Chronicle. My father read Walter Williams. But you got to get to a point where you have to ask, do I agree with Walter Williams? I have to be able to be willing to challenge my own biases. So that's what I mean when I say to think, to be searching for truth. And then number two is to be inspired by economics. And that can be, I think, actually a very hard sell, because economics can be very dry and very boring. And so how can I inspire people to be interested in this subject? So I guess those are the two goals. I hope I've done that to some extent during my career. I'm sure a lot of students came through and were not inspired by economics. But I like to hope that some were.
No, I mean, I definitely was. And I feel like that's one thing that I feel like I can, it's part of one of the reasons why why this podcast is created is 2016 election was happening. And I just feel like there was a lack of I would say real journalism or just real understanding of movements and trends. And, this might not be economics, but the underlying forces were economic forces. And so I was like, well, I'm going to figure this out. Like, I'm going to do some research. And I think a lot of that, was driven by, that desire to say, learn what's going on. So, again, good teachers make a big impact. I guess that'll be the main takeaway of this episode is good teachers make a big impact. Shifting gears a little bit, I want to talk a little bit about investing. So you've also started a high school investing club. It would be great to hear a little bit about that and how you got started. But this question's from my wife. And the question was, what kind of gifts have you given your wife over the years? Or, as my wife would say, when you choose to invest in her rather than in stocks or bonds or whatnot. And maybe you can talk a little bit about your investment philosophy and what gifts you have given her over the years.
Yeah. So what you're referring to is I tell a lot of stories in class about gifts that I've given over the years. Many of the stories are very poor gifts that I have given.
Extension cord was one for Christmas.
Extension cord was one. That's a true story. Well, because what my wife told me was, she said, you need to listen to me to buy good gifts. You have to listen to me. And when I say, like, during the year that there's something that I need, then you want to kind of put that away and, come back and buy it when Christmas comes. And I remember we were setting up the Christmas lights and she said, boy, we always need more extension cords. And I thought, oh, well, I'll buy her extension cords for Christmas. I thought I was applying the general concept.
Right.
But, obviously that was a poor gift. But I think if I be a little bit more philosophical about the gift, part of the reason for telling those stories is philosophically, with regards to gift giving, we were young and poor. And I wanted someday to be old and wealthy. And by the way, I want to be clear to say, I don't want to be wealthy because I wanted to buy a yacht someday, or because I wanted to buy a beach house someday, or, those kind of things. I wanted to be wealthy so I could get control of my life.
Right.
So I have control of my time, financial control of my life. And I decide when I go to work, what I do with my time. Time is all we have. And wealth allows you to get control of your time. It allows you to decide whether you work or not. So I'm young and poor, and I want to be, old and wealthy. Actually, I don't want to be old. I just want to be wealthy. But, time goes by. We have no choice in that. And so in order to accumulate wealth, we had to save. We had to save and invest. It was the only way to do it, which meant that we had to reduce our consumption.
Right.
And that meant, here's the philosophical position, that meant that my gifts had to be in terms of time instead of material products. And so, I did not buy jewelry for my wife. I've never bought super expensive. I buy nicer gifts now than I did before. I have more money than I did before. But, I still don't buy things like, a car. Some people see advertisements on TV buying a car for Christmas or whatever. I don't do any of those things, but that's because I think instead of investing in terms of material things, it is investing in terms of time. Right. That is what really matters. So Charles Murray once wrote a piece in the Wall Street Journal about the two types of marriages. He said there were two types of marriages. So the first one was what he called a merger marriage.
Yeah.
So a merger marriage would be when two, well-established older professionals, I say older, like late 20s maybe or something like that, get married. That's a merger marriage. And there's nothing wrong with merger marriages. They're not better or worse, but just different than what are called startup marriages.
Yeah.
My wife and I had a startup marriage. And so we started with nothing. We were two young people who had no money, and we got married, and we had to go out into the world, and we had to make it.
Yeah.
And, part of making it was controlling the consumption. And I would say now that my wife would look back now, she would not have agreed with this when she was in her 20s and 30s. She was often angry at me for the lack of gift giving. But she would say now that the saving and investing that we did was worth it. We can do things in our lives that other people in our financial situation cannot do. Other people in our income level cannot do because they did not save and invest. So that was the philosophical position behind those silly stories. And of course, I hand them up a little bit in class and so forth. But there's still truth to them.
Yeah. Well, I have a brother now.
The very first Christmas gift that I bought her, we still have it. It does not work anymore. It might have been like $5. It was this little music box. And, you turn had a little skater on what was like a pond. And, you would twist the music box, and this little skater would spin around on this music box, and it would play this music. That was the first gift I ever gave her.
Yeah.
And, it was very cheap. It doesn't work anymore. But from a merger marriage point of view, we can now look back at that. We can look at what we have now, and we can look back at that little gift, and it tells us where we were.
Yeah.
There's where we started, and here's where we are now. So that's kind of the philosophical concept.
That's a great framework. I feel like if you had Instagram, you could see one of my first posts after we got married. I described my marriage with Celeste as a merger marriage because we were older, we'd both been working, but because I went back to school, I kind of went from one income bracket down to nothing.
Yep.
And so I feel like we had some startup experiences. We moved to Texas for 3 months. I was in school, and like you said, one's not better, one's not worse, but I was grateful to have kind of both experiences because I think they teach you different lessons.
Yes, absolutely. So I never had the merger experience. So whatever those lessons are, I never learned them. But the lesson of the merger, I think, is if you make it, building something together, when you start with nothing, there's a lot of strength in that relationship.
Yep. Well, maybe we'll have your wife on as a guest episode. She can.
She is probably the one to interview to really learn about Larry Hagen and who I am. She knows more intimately than anybody in the world.
Yeah, well, it'd be interesting. And you've also talked about how now that you've kind of made it through. In entrepreneurship, there's a term called bootstrapping, and basically you bootstrap, right? Don't consume. Very, very frugal, but you're past the bootstrapping stage. And so you've had to teach yourself, and this is what at least you've told me, is that it's okay to spend money on stuff now. You're at afraid.
Yeah.
You had to teach yourself that, right? Isn't that?
Yeah. Very, very difficult still difficult to do. I do it, but it's not easy. So the way I'll say it in class is I have to practice spending.
Yeah.
Because it doesn't come naturally to me. But fortunately, my wife is there to help me practice spending. She's very, very good at it. So we still live on a budget.
Yeah.
But the spending portion of the budget is much larger than it was before. So there was a guy I used to listen to on the radio, and I followed this, what he used to call the $1,000 rule. And he said, when you build enough wealth, you start following the $1,000 rule. And the $1,000 rule was, if something costs $1,000 or less, you just do it.
Yeah, you don't worry about it.
You don't worry about it. You just do it. And so I started following the $1,000 rule just as a way to kind of practice spending.
Yeah.
So my wife says, we need new furniture for the deck. And then I say, how much? And she, $850. All right, go do it.
Yeah. No.
But it's not easy because I'm going to say this, one thing I learned about myself, and I think it's different from most people. Most people get happiness from the consumption side. Okay. From the demand side. That's where they get their happiness in the world, from buying things. I get my happiness from the supply side, from producing. And so for me, the consumption has been particularly hard because it just doesn't get, I'll do it. It's kind of fun at the moment, but it really doesn't give me lasting satisfaction the way producing does.
Yeah.
So, the fact that we're having this conversation and that I taught Matt Hubbard, and he likes econ and he's inspired by it, that's much more satisfying to me than any beach house I could ever buy.
Yeah.
And so when I look at, one of the things that we did in our house is we built built-in bookcases in our one room. And when I look at that built-in bookcase, my wife looks at it and she says, "Oh, it looks pretty." And I look at it and I think, I built that bookcase, with what I taught Matt Hubbard and what I taught this other guy and this other guy and this other person. And, that's what built that bookcase. And to me, that's what it signifies.
Yeah.
That's much more inspiring to me. That's much more satisfying to me.
Yeah. I would tend to agree. Well, thanks for sharing. I kind of want to pivot here as well. And ask you two questions related to, I would say, real world events. As a student of economics and student of life, and just of current events as well. One question is kind of related to what we've just been talking to, spending, saving. I want to ask you about your thoughts on national debt, current fiscal policy. Maybe we'll just say this. Fiscal policy in the United States, some thoughts, concerns you have. And then the second question I want to ask about is about big tech, but we'll get there. First one's first. What's current views of fiscal policy in the U.S.?
So first, let me just say, remind me, let's come back because I didn't do it. Let's come back to the investment club at some point. But
yes.
Okay. Let's answer in the current question, but let's try to circle back to that if we can. I'd like to talk about that a little bit. But so I think one thing, okay, this comes back to having, being an open-minded thinker. I think something that I have learned from the past 18 months is, on a technical level, not a political statement, but on an economic technical level, my previous bias was wrong with regards to fiscal policy. I think fiscal policy was important in March and April of 2020.
Yep.
I think it was real that if governments are not sending people checks to cover their mortgages, their rent payments, their car payments, tuition for school, I think a greater crash was possible. Now, that said, it was also in some ways a government-induced recession. Maybe, I'm not sure, but maybe, because governments are telling you that you can't produce.
Right.
So I guess if the government's telling you that you cannot produce, that your restaurant can't be open and therefore your workers are going to get laid off, then I guess if they're going to tell you that you can't earn an income, then they better support you in some way.
Right.
So maybe this was a perfect storm where fiscal policy was necessary, and maybe other times it tends to be overused. So let me come back and restate that. I think I'm wrong to be against all fiscal policy. I think fiscal policy can have a place, but I think it's overused. And so that's a little more subtle position than I would have taken in the past. In the past, I would have said fiscal policy is bad, balance your budget, move on. Now I think I'm willing to concede that fiscal policy has its place, but it's overused. We do it too much. And if we really were going to follow the teachings of John Maynard Keynes, what he really said was government should spend against the wind. During recessions, governments spend and run deficits. And then during boom times, they cut spending and run surpluses and pay off the deficits. So we never do the second part. So I guess I would be more accepting of the Keynesian principles if we ever actually ran surpluses and paid off some of that debt, then, maybe I'd be more open to that concept. But politically, that just might not be possible.
It's a tough, yeah.
And so that's the second thing that I'd want to say is where I think that I have found that my bias was correct, that while fiscal policy may have its place at times in small doses, in reasonable doses, whatever small and reasonable mean. But I think what I'm right about is good economics does not always translate into good politics.
Yeah.
So what might be a good economic idea, once the lobbyists and the politicians get a hold of it, they hijack it for their own purposes. And you end up with a policy that's, really nothing like what you really needed.
Yeah.
And so I think I was wrong about the first part, but I think I was right about the second part. I think those are the lessons that I would have learned over the last 18 months.
Yeah, that's well said. Every politician wants to, who doesn't want to be Santa Claus or,
Sure.
and hand out money, but
who gets elected by promising, to cut your benefits and raise your taxes to balance the budget? When was that a winning strategy?
Hasn't been for a long time.
Political election. No, it hasn't been. So I guess I would just always say my position is going to be, if we're as a society going to decide to spend money, then we ought to pay for it either by raising taxes. I'm willing to run deficits for a time. They have a place, they have a function, but we have to either raise taxes or cut spending during other times in order to pay back those bills.
Right.
That would be my position. Some level of fiscal responsibility needs to be there. And I don't think that we see that right now in Washington, D.C. When we talk about the investment, the infrastructure investment bill, okay, my position would be, okay, if we want to spend $3 trillion on infrastructure, if that's really true, and we need to rebuild roads and, all this kind of stuff, fine, cut $3 trillion somewhere else.
Yeah.
And then let's do it. Right. But let's live within our means, would be my argument. Should we have run deficits back in March of 2020? Yeah, maybe we should have. But, as we come out of this, we need to have a plan to pay it back. There won't be one. It won't happen. But that's what I would prefer.
Yeah, totally. Excellent analysis, excellent viewpoint. Viewpoint worth discussing. So thanks for sharing.
Yeah, right. I might be wrong with everything I just said. Right?
Yeah. Second question I kind of want is something else that there's a lot of, it tends to unite both the left and the right a little bit, is big tech. And, one thing we always talk about in economics, especially AP economics, is the different type of economic structures, monopolies, oligopolies, competitive markets, etc.
Yep.
And there seems to be a lot of concern over how much power big tech, I'll just say, Facebook, Amazon, Google as big tech. What do you think regulation is needed? Coming from an Austrian Hayekian viewpoint, regulations kind of, if you have it, very light. But some of the concerns with big tech is that the amount of power that they yield, not just in the market, but also politically, and also influencing information, what gets out there, what doesn't get out there. So it's not just market power that they have, but also social and political power as well. And that seems to have united both camps. So I guess what would, help walk us through, kind of dissect this issue a little bit.
So first of all, on the political question, I would say I lack any expertise. I'm just some guy with an opinion.
You don't have an Instagram, so that's fair. Okay. You don't even have Facebook.
You don't have Instagram. And maybe later we'll talk about why I don't have Instagram. It was a conscious choice not to. But let's talk about the economics for a moment. So typically with economics, the way you think about monopoly is if a firm develops monopoly power, very rarely are there like true monopolies where some company is the only producer of a good. That's rare. But having monopoly power over the consumer, that would be a problem that economists would worry about. And the evidence of monopoly power, usually where we would look for that is in the company charging prices above the marginal cost. I don't want to be too technical, but this concept of marginal cost in economics, firms face costs, they charge prices above it. And the higher the price is above their marginal costs, the greater the market power that they have. And there's various economic indexes that we would use to try to figure out how much market power they have. A Lerner index, a 4-firm concentration ratio, things like this. So if a firm is charging a price too far above their costs, that is probably evidence that they have market power. And under those conditions, I am at least open to government getting involved and trying to encourage a more competitive marketplace. I think that is a potentially reasonable economic role for the government.
Right.
However, the problem that is created with the tech situation is they don't charge prices.
Right.
Right. So, you use Google, you use Facebook. There's not a price to using. You don't pay a bill to use it. And so how do we, from an economic standpoint, establish that they have market power? And then what do we do about it? If they're charging a zero price, what do we do to empower the consumer? And so I'm going to say that I think I'm able to state the problem. I don't know if I'm able to state a solution.
Yeah.
But one possible solution that I've read about, which is an interesting one, is we alter private property rights. So, and this would be of course, the government would have to do this, but it would be a relatively minimal way for government to get involved. And that is to shift private property rights over your data from, say, Facebook to Larry Hagen.
Yep.
And then if they want to sell my data, they have to share the proceeds with me. They have to get my permission because I own it. Information about me, about what I post on Facebook, about what articles I read, about what products I consume. Before they bundle that and sell it to an advertising company, they got to get permission from me, and they got to share with me the proceeds from that. So I think that strikes me as a reasonable first step in trying to empower the consumer against these very large producers that do seem to have some level of monopoly power in the market.
Yeah. No, it is interesting. I've heard the phrase "data is the new oil."
Yes, I've heard.
And so it is interesting. It's an interesting viewpoint, worth discussing. Kind of my thoughts on, something I've been thinking about, something I read was there's a concern, and maybe this is more on the political side, so I guess I'll fill in for that. We do need to worry about bigness, but just because a company is big doesn't necessarily mean it needs to be regulated or brought back down to size. An example that this one writer that I read reference was IBM. IBM in the 60s, 70s was the tech company, right? It was the Apple, Facebook, but no one worries about IBM anymore. And I would say the same thing of Microsoft in the 90s too.
So let me just jump in there real fast with Microsoft in the 90s. Yeah, everybody's worried about that they were a monopoly. I think there was a judge in a case down in Florida who actually was calling for the breaking up of Microsoft. Yeah. Right. So I think you're absolutely right. We have to be careful, not to go too far, because it's not just the competitors that Microsoft faced in the 1990s, which weren't many. What also matters is the potential competitors.
Yep.
And so Microsoft had almost no competitors. Okay, maybe they're a monopoly, whatever. And everybody's worried about it. And 5 years later, Microsoft is irrelevant. I mean, they're relevant again now, but there was a time period where, like, who was Microsoft? Nobody paid attention to them at all. So, so I think I think you're absolutely right. We have got to be careful on not to not destroy markets with over-regulation. However, I do think it is a legitimate role of the state to encourage competition, but boy, you have to be really careful how you do it. And that's why I kind of like the idea of shifting private property rights and then just allowing the market to work going forward.
Yeah.
So that's an interesting concept. Anyway, I interrupted you. You were going to tell me about the politics, what you're worried about in terms of the politics of these companies being too strong in controlling information.
Well, there's again, it's kind of based on economic principles too, but in the political sphere, whether mergers or acquisitions get approved, there's something called the Bork rule, named after a Chicago Booth guy. And basically the rule was, does this newly combined company or does this merger create consumer harm? Like, does it consumer welfare, consumer surplus? Is that going all to the newly monopoly? And that's kind of been the standard to look at past mergers, which is, why Facebook and Instagram got approved, because it wasn't any harm to the consumer. It was actually a benefit. But there's been a new school of thought where it's like, no, bigness for itself is concerning. That's another outlet that is falling under one company's control. And we need to be concerned about that. And that's potentially bad for democracy because it's one actor who controls all this information, all this outlet. And, that's a fair point. It's just much harder of a standard to judge against, because what one group of people might think is bad for democracy, another group of people might not. And it's an opinion, right? How do you argue over an opinion?
It lacks a clear and measurable standard,
right,
for government behavior. And then of course that opens you up to slippery slope and that sort of thing. So I think this is a really hard issue for the right, for the political right at the moment, because, if you're on the political right, you seem to have two important beliefs of the political right that are now in conflict with each other. And that is the freedom of the corporation, right? It's a private company. They'd be able to do what they want. They can post whatever they want, Twitter or whatever.
They can restrict whoever they want. They can
restrict anything they want. They're a private company. But then of course, free speech is also very important. And so is it, which one of those priorities is more important?
Yeah.
The freedom of the company or the freedom of speech? And I'm not sure that I know what the answer to that is, but it creates a very hard situation, I think, on the political right. Which one is the more important of the two? I don't know.
Yeah, and I feel like any politician, right, in their quest to solve issues, they might do a little more harm. Don't throw out your principles just to solve for one. So is kind of what I would say. But
yeah, but of course, if you're a politician, you have to get reelected.
Yeah, that's their job. That's what their job.
If you don't get reelected, you don't get to do anything. So
then you're back to square one.
That's right. So let me just say, I'm glad I'm not one. I'm glad I'm not a politician.
It would be tough. It really, you basically can't please anybody. It's a tough. Well, I guess you can. It's a tough job. That's for sure. It would be a real tough job. Well, thanks for those viewpoints. Really good econ discussion. We're kind of coming up here on a closing. I want to wrap up, let you go back to talking about the investment club at Ephrata. Why don't you go ahead and share a little bit about that?
Yeah. So one of my strong motivations as an economics teacher has always been investing. And one might say, well, Hagen, investing, that's finance. That's not economics. And I think that traditionally would have been the case. But I don't think that's true anymore. I think there's a lot of economic research that has been done on investing, and take my bias for what it's worth. I think the economists tend to be right about, at least for the average investor, they tend to be right about indexing and keeping costs low and all those kind of things. And that doesn't come out of Wall Street. That comes out of economic research at universities and so forth. And so to me, that becomes then a fundamentally important part of an economic curriculum. And so I've always included it as part of my curriculum. We have always taught investing principles. We've always looked at the different theories of investing. And when I took my first son to college, he was a finance major and he was thinking about joining this thing called an investment club. At his college, they had like $250,000 and students would join it and they would, research companies and pick stocks and own them in this fund. And I thought, well, why are we not doing that at Ephrata High School? And so I put together a plan and I went to the superintendent. I went to the various administrators and eventually presented to this wonderful foundation, the Ephrata Area Education Foundation. And it is a group of business and community leaders who collect donations and use that money to carry out various different educational programs in the schools. And so I went to them and asked them for $30,000 to start a high school investment club. And they agreed to do it. I give them tremendous credit. I think we are, as far as I know, we are at least one of the very few schools in the state, maybe in the country, that is doing this sort of thing. We ran into a lot of difficulties. There's legal difficulties because as a public school, we cannot own shares in companies. Governments cannot own shares in companies. And so the way it's set up is this Ephrata Area Education Foundation is a private organization and they actually own the shares.
Got it.
But students are the ones that choose the companies that we're going to own. So the way that we set it up is we have, let's see, this year we probably had 20 to 25 students in the investment club. And we elect a president of the club, a vice president, we call it a chairman or chairperson. We have a vice chair, and they assign all the students to different sectors.
Yep.
The students in those sectors analyze companies. Oh, by the way, I should add, they have to go through a set of video tutorials that I created in order to be voting members in the club. So they need some educational background. This is real money that we're investing. So they go through this education program. They have to take some quizzes along the way. Then they become part of the voting committee. Then they're assigned to these different committees, different sectors. They analyze companies within those sectors and then recommend purchases to the group. So, you see, I literally have students standing up in front of this committee arguing for different companies that we should invest in. Eventually, at the end, the committee takes a vote and we choose the companies that we would invest in. And that $30,000 about 3 weeks ago, for the first time was finally invested. I should also add one other interesting part of this is we only allow students to purchase companies that are in the Vanguard Social Responsibility Index Fund, so that we are not buying things that would be.
You're not buying penny stocks.
Yeah, we're not buying penny stocks, but we're also not buying, shares in companies that might be doing things that would be, morally questionable.
Totally.
And so we're allowing Vanguard to be our standard for determining the social acceptability of companies. And then so we can invest in any companies that are inside of that fund. So 3 weeks ago, I got together with a person from the Ephrata Area Education Foundation, and we sat down in a local restaurant, and we carried out the purchases that were requested by the students. So it was a really cool moment. It's really exciting, and I think for students, it's a wonderful opportunity to do real world analysis with real money. It's not pretend; it's real stuff.
Yeah, it really is a special opportunity. I mean, one of the things you do at college, in my MBA program, there's a group that does the exact same thing. I mean, the money's a little bit bigger, I think around 3 million, but like it's not a little bit bigger, but like the principle is the same, right? I mean, it's an investing club, and to be able to do that in high school, I think just makes it like, it's just a cool opportunity. So I guess kudos to you, kudos to the Ephrata the
Ephrata Area Education Foundation.
Yeah, kudos to them, because I mean, these type of experiences, especially in high school, have a lasting impact. And even if they don't go into a financial related field personally, it can only help them personally with financial management as well, and personal finance. So
yeah, and one of our goals was not just that the students involved benefit from this, but we want this to be something that other students who are going through Ephrata, they might not be involved in it, but they see it.
Yeah, they
right.
Hear about it.
And we can talk about it. We can, maybe at some point, we couldn't do this kind of stuff with COVID, but at some point we might have, some of the students in the investment club, maybe go into some lower grades and talk to students about the investment club and use it as a way to teach about investing. That someday this fund is going to be worth, there's going to be $100,000, and we're going to be talking about how it used to be 30.
Yep.
And we've turned it into 100, and that's what investing means. And so you can do this in your own life. You can turn 30 into 100 slowly over time with sound investment principles. So, to me, that's the bigger concept that we want to teach from this. So it's great for the kids that are involved. For some of them, it's going to be life-changing. It's going to change the direction of their life and what they do with their profession. But for some students, they're just going to learn that saving and investing is good for me as a person.
Yeah.
And I think that's an important lesson as well. So we call it the Mounts Fund. And someday when it gets bigger, we may split it into two separate competing funds. And so I imagine someday we might have the Mounts Fund and the Gold Fund. Right. And, beyond there, we're the Ephrata Mountaineers. That's where.
Yes, I was going to reference that, but yes, yeah, Mountaineers.
Yep. So yeah, it's very exciting. Very exciting opportunity.
It's an awesome opportunity. It really is. And it kind of makes me want to go back to high school a little bit, but then again, I'm doing this personally. My wife and I, we have our own fund that we're. You got
your own fund. You got the Hubbard Fund, right?
We got the Hubbard Fund. I'm sure you're not using Robin Hood to execute these trades.
That's right. That is correct.
But there is yes, the Hubbard Fund is also up and running as well. So, yes. But I think about these, my senior year. So I took AP Econ my junior year. My senior year is when I think you really hit upon the investing. The political econ class is when you really hit upon the investing. At least you used to. That's how.
Yes, that's correct. And what I've done is I've taken those lessons and created videos of those lessons, and that's what the students in the investment club go through.
Yeah. The great Tulip crash of 1619 and dash are still lasting impact on me. So for the listeners, go do a little research on the Tulip craze in the 1600s. It's a eye-opening experience for sure. Mr. Hagen, thanks a lot for coming on. This has been a real treat, not only for me, but my listeners. I know it'll be a real treat for them. Really enjoyed having you come on. Appreciate it. I guess
it's a treat for me, man. And I've always said, over the years, parents have come, have said to me, thank you for what you do, stuff like that. And, that's nice. And it makes me feel good. But, what I really say is, thank you for sending me kids like Matt Hubbard. Right. And these families in Ephrata, they just keep sending me these great kids. And it's like, it's amazing. So,
well, last story before the send off, this, I got to tell it. So when I got married, my wife and I did an open house back in Ephrata, and you came in attendance. You came early because I think your son had a baseball game or something. But again, part of the LDS church, there's congregations, and a lot of the families in our ward have sent kids to your class, and Mr. Hagen's known to have a little bit of a reputation in the community, and so when he's sitting there talking in our house at the open house, and one parent comes up and he's like, I'm Mr. Ludwig, and he's like, I'm Mr. Hagen, and this parent was like, oh, don't worry, I know who you are. Yeah, and it was a cool impact to see, cool experience to see the broader impact. Like I said, good teachers make big impacts, and that's certainly true for you. So again, thanks for everything, and thanks for coming on the podcast. And maybe we'll get your wife on next in a couple of years. This is, I'm taking a stop after this one, but maybe in a couple of years she can tell the other side of the story.
Tell the other side of the story. Yes.
Awesome.
Probably the true side of the story.
Mhm.
Hey, thanks for having me on, Hubbard. I appreciate it, man.
Well, thank you, Mr. Hagen. We'll see you.
Yep. It's great talking to you.
Bye.